Many years ago, in a busy neighborhood in Kano, there lived a man whose name was very popular in the streets, especially during Ramadan. His name was Alhaji Suleiman Dantata. People spoke of him with admiration, and hungry men especially spoke of him with hope. In that part of the city, Ramadan evenings were very special. As the sun prepared to go home, the entire neighborhood began preparing for iftar. The smell of fried puff-puff floated through the air. Pots of rice bubbled inside kitchens, and mothers shouted instructions to children who moved like confused chickens. However, near the mosque, something else happened every evening. A crowd gathered outside a large cream-colored house with a tall black gate. That house belonged to Alhaji Suleiman. People arrived carrying plastic bowls, small coolers, old buckets, or sometimes nothing at all except hope. Everyone knew what would happen next. Alhaji Suleiman would come outside and distribute food to the poor. In the beginning, this had been a very simple act. He would place a few plates of food outside his gate for travelers who had nothing to eat. But then, praise entered as a powerful fertilizer, and soon the act of charity became a neighborhood spectacle. Every evening before the Maghrib prayer, the streets in front of his house looked like a small festival of people, and he always appeared with dignity. He would step outside wearing a spotless white kaftan that moved gently in the evening breeze. His bed remained carefully arranged, and his cap sat proudly on his head like a small crown. Behind him stood large trays of food prepared by his household staff: rice, beans, fried meat, and of course, dates and kunu. The poor people would greet him respectfully. Alhaji, may God reward you. Alhaji, may your wealth increase. And Alhaji Suleiman would nod slowly like a man who understood the weight of generosity. However, before the food began moving, something else always happened. The cameras came. Two young men usually arrived first to arrange the video equipment, and another man carried a professional camera with a long lens that looked serious enough to photograph the moon. They greeted Alhaji Suleiman respectfully. "Good evening, sir. Are you ready?" Alhaji Suleiman always answered sweetly, "Yes, let us begin." That was when the real ceremony started. He would stand near the gate while the poor people formed a line. The cameraman would then move around, searching for the best angle. "Sir, hold the plate higher." "No, sir, look toward the camera." "Sir, give the food slowly." Alhaji Suleiman would obey patiently. He handed plates of rice to old women, placed meat inside children's bowls, and shook hands with elderly men. All while the cameras captured every moment. The photographer would smile with satisfaction. "Excellent shots." Sometimes Alhaji Suleiman even paused for a moment before handing the food to allow the camera to focus properly, and the poor people never complained. After all, food is food, and hunger had no pride. Among the people working for Alhaji was a man named Bello. Bello was Alhaji Suleiman's driver. He had been working for the household for 3 years. His job was simple: drive the bus, open the gates, and carry things when needed. He said very little but observed everything. Bello usually stood near the wall during the food distribution, watching the activity quietly, and he noticed things others did not notice. He noticed how the cameras must first start rolling before the food sharing begins. He noticed how the plates were arranged neatly in front of the gate so that the background looked impressive. He noticed how Alhaji Suleiman's assistant sometimes rearranged the line of poor people. "You move forward." No, stand here." "Yes, that looks better." One evening, a small boy stepped forward eagerly, holding a tiny plastic bowl. The cameraman quickly stopped him. "Wait!" The boy looked confused. "Why?" The cameraman adjusted the camera again and said, "Stand beside the old woman. It looks better that way." The boy obeyed and the camera clicked. Alhaji Suleiman smiled warmly while giving him rice. The boy did not understand why the photographer had to arrange hungry people like furniture, but Bello understood. Later that evening, the photographer finished his work. "Sir, we have excellent footage today." Alhaji Suleiman nodded. "Good." The cameras left and the street slowly became quiet again. The trays of food began disappearing, not because the crowd had finished eating, but because the cameraman had disappeared. Immediately, the assistants began carrying the remaining trays of food back into the house. Some people who arrived late stood outside the gates confused. One old man asked politely, "Is the food finished?" One assistant quickly answered him, "Yes, sir. Come tomorrow." The man slowly walked away. Bello watched the empty bowl in the man's hands and his heart broke. That night, while driving Alhaji Suleiman to the mosque, Bello spoke up. "Sir, yes? The people who arrived late today did not receive food." Alhaji Suleiman nodded casually. "That is normal." Bello hesitated. "But sir, there was still food inside." Alhaji Suleiman smiled. Bello, "Yes, sir." The distribution had already finished. Bello nodded and kept his eyes on the road. But inside his mind, something had begun scratching like a small rat behind a wall. Finished? That word did not sit well with him because Bello had seen the trays of food. They were not empty. He had even helped carry them inside. Yet, outside the gates, hungry people had still been waiting with empty bowls. Bello said nothing more that night because a driver who wants to keep his job does not interrogate the man who pays his salary. The next evening, the neighborhood returned to its usual Ramadan excitement. By 5 o'clock, people had already begun gathering near Alhaji Suleiman's gates. Women stood holding bowls and a few elderly men leaned on their walking sticks. One woman named Mama Hafsat arrived with 2 small children. She sold fried bean cakes near the market during the day, but unfortunately, Ramadan was difficult for her because business slowed down during the fasting period. So, the daily food from Alhaji Suleiman's house helped her children survive the months. She greeted Bello when she saw him. "Bello, my son." "Good evening, Mama Hafsat," he greeted. "Is there food today?" she asked. Bello nodded politely. "There is always food." Mama Hafsat smiled with relief. "May God reward your boss." Bello smiled. Soon, the familiar ritual began. The cameramen arrived first. One carried a video camera and another carried a bright ring light that made the gates glow like a small movie set. The photographer began arranging things. "Please stand in line, no pushing. Yes, you with the red scarf, stand there." He turned to Alhaji Suleiman and said, "Sir, today we will start with the elderly people. It looks powerful that way." Alhaji Suleiman nodded slowly like a man supervising a national project. "Very good." The camera was switched on and the charity began. Plates of rice moved from tray to bowls. Children smiled. Old women raised their hands in prayer and the cameraman whispered excitedly, "Excellent footage." Meanwhile, Bello stood near the gates watching. Just then, something strange happened. While the cameras were still recording, Bello noticed a black SUV parked across the street. 2 men sat inside the vehicle. They were not part of the crowd. Neither were they poor people waiting for food. They were simply watching. Bello felt small uneasiness. He had seen that vehicle before, but he could not immediately remember where. The cameraman finally shouted, "That is enough." He lowered the camera and said, "Sir, we have everything." Alhaji Suleiman wiped his hands with a handkerchief. Good. The cameras were switched off. The photographers packed their equipment and left with friendly smiles. "See you tomorrow, sir." As usual, as soon as their car turned the corner, the assistants began carrying the remaining trays back inside the house. But some people on the line had not yet received food. Mama Hafsat raised her voice. "Excuse me." The assistant paused. "Yes, there are still people here." The assistant shrugged. "The distribution is finished." Mama Hafsat looked confused. "But the trays of food are not empty." The assistant answered casually. "That is the instruction." They packed up and closed the gates while the hungry people stood outside silently. After some minutes, some walked away shaking their heads while some stayed for a moment hoping the gates would open again. Mama Hafsat looked toward Bello and asked, "Is this a mistake?" Bello felt pity for her. He lowered his voice and said, "I don't know." Just then, across the street, the black SUV engine started and the vehicle drove away slowly. Bello's eyes followed it until it disappeared. That was when something finally returned to his memory. He had seen that same SUV outside the office building where Alhaji Suleiman sometimes held meetings with businessmen. Bello frowned slightly. What could be the connection? Meanwhile, inside the compound, Alhaji Suleiman walked towards the house comfortably, as if nothing unusual had happened. The crowd outside slowly scattered like birds whose food had suddenly disappeared. Bello remained near the gate for a moment. Mama Hafsat and her two children were still standing there with their bowls. The children looked tired and hungry. The woman tried to smile. "Maybe tomorrow," she said. Bello nodded. "Yes, maybe tomorrow." She walked away slowly with her children. Bello watched them helplessly until they turned the corner. Then he opened the gate and entered the compound. Inside the house, the atmosphere was different. The kitchen looked busy. Large trays of food still sat on the table. Trays of rice, beans, and fried meats that were enough to feed many people. One assistant laughed while scooping the food into plastic containers. "Pack the rest for the storage freezer," he said. Another worker nodded. "Yes, so it's for tomorrow's distribution." Bello stood at the door and said, "But there were still people outside." The assistant shrugged. "That is not our problem." Bello insisted, "But the food is still here." The assistant laughed and said, "My brother, the camera people have gone, so no more sharing." Bello said nothing more. He turned and walked into the sitting room. Alhaji Suleiman sat comfortably on a large chair, drinking cold juice and watching the news. The television showed a news program about Ramadan charity across the country. The presenter was praising wealthy men who fed the poor during the fasting season. Alhaji Suleiman smiled proudly while watching. "Look at that. People are beginning to appreciate generosity." Bello stood quietly. Then he spoke up. "Sir." "Yes." "Why do we stop the food when the cameras leave?" Alhaji Suleiman lowered the glass slowly and looked at Bello twice. "Come here." Bello stepped closer. Alhaji Suleiman spoke in a calm voice. "Do you know how reputation works?" Bello did not answer. Alhaji continued. "People respect generosity." "Yes, sir," Bello nodded. "But people must see generosity first before they can respect it." Bello listened attentively. Alhaji Suleiman leaned back in his chair and said, "These pictures and videos travel everywhere." He pointed toward his phone on the table, across social media, to business partners, community leaders, everywhere. He smiled again. Everybody must see the evidence. Bello finally understood something now. The food was not the main event. The photographs were the star of the show. Bello lowered his head slightly. "I see." Alhaji Suleiman nodded. "Good." Then he added something that made Bello uncomfortable. "The food is charity, but the image is investment." Bello left the room slowly and went outside the compound gate where the streets had become quiet again. His mind refused to calm down. He sat on a wooden bench near the generator house to think. The quiet streets looked really peaceful. Then he heard footsteps. Mama Hafsat approached him again. She carried the same empty bowl and called, "Bello." "Yes, Mama," he answered. "Did the food truly finish?" she asked. Bello hesitated. His mind struggled between loyalty and honesty. Finally, he answered, "There was still food." Mama Hafsat looked down at the bowl in her hands. Her voice became miserable. "My children slept hungry." Bello felt his chest tighten. She continued speaking. "I waited there for 3 hours." Bello could not look at her face. Then she said something that made his chest explode. "I may not know anything, but I know that charity that stops for the camera is not charity." With that, she walked away slowly into the dark streets. Bello remained on the bench. The small rat that had begun scratching inside his mind now felt like a full storm, because for the first time since he started working for Alhaji Suleiman, Bello began wondering whether the generosity he had been helping with every evening was something else entirely. And the more he thought about it, the more he became confused. That night, Bello slept badly. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the same picture. Mama Hafsat standing outside the locked gate with an empty bowl, her children standing beside her, while the trays of rice went inside the house. By dawn, Bello had already made a decision. If something did not feel right, at least a man should understand it clearly before pretending it was normal. He would find out the truth. That morning, the sun rose slowly over the neighborhood, and by mid-morning, the streets became active again. Bello drove Alhaji Suleiman to his office building in the city center. The building stood tall beside several other commercial offices. Businessmen entered and exited like people chasing invisible opportunities. Bello parked the car and stepped outside. Almost immediately, his eyes landed on something familiar: the black SUV, the same vehicle he had seen across the streets during the food distribution the previous evening. It was parked near the entrance of the building, and two men leaned beside it talking quietly. Bello recognized one of them. He was one of the businessmen who often met with Alhaji Suleiman. The man greeted him. "Driver." Bello nodded politely. "Good morning, sir." Inside the building, Alhaji Suleiman disappeared into a conference room with several men, while Bello remained outside near the reception area waiting. The driver's life often involves waiting, and waiting teaches patience, but it also teaches listening. Through the half-open door, Bello began hearing parts of the conversation inside the room. At first, the voices sounded normal. They talked about business, numbers, and plans. Then something strange appeared in the conversation. One man said clearly, "The Ramadan distribution pictures have been very useful." Another man laughed. "Yes, so people trust Alhaji Suleiman now." A third voice added, "Investors like men who appear generous." The room was filled with laughter. Then another sentence arrived. "Next week, we'll announce the foundation." Bello frowned slightly. "Foundation?" Another voice spoke. "The charity account must remain under Suleiman's name. It looks good." Bello's stomach tightened. "Charity account?" He leaned closer to the door without making noise. Inside the room, Alhaji Suleiman spoke now. "Those pictures are working perfectly. If you see the comments online, one of the men asked. "And the food?" Alhaji Suleiman laughed. "The food is the smallest part, Jare." The room laughed again. Bello felt something heavy drop inside his chest. Now, the puzzle pieces began connecting clearly. The Ramadan charity had another purpose. It was for reputation, influence, and business advantage. The poor people outside the gates were not the main story. They were part of the advertisements. Bello stepped away from the door slowly. His head felt hot. By evening, they returned to the house again, and as usual, the crowd gathered outside the gates. Mama Hafsat stood there again with her children. Other families arrived carrying bowls. The familiar camera crew also appeared with lights and cameras. Alhaji Suleiman stepped outside wearing his bright white kaftan. The ceremony began again. Plates moved, cameras clicked, and prayers filled the air. Bello watched quietly, but this time something different happened. Across the street, a young woman stood holding a small notebook. She observed the scene carefully. She was not holding a bowl or waiting for food. She was studying the entire event. Bello noticed her immediately. After the cameramen finished their recording and packed their equipment, the young woman approached Bello. "Excuse me." Bello looked at her. "Yes." "My name is Rukaya." She showed him a small press card. "I am a journalist." Bello felt his heartbeat rise slightly. She continued speaking. "I have been watching this charity distribution for several days." Bello remained silent. Rukaya lowered her voice. "Something about it feels strange." She looked directly at him and asked, "You work for Alhaji Suleiman, right?" Bello hesitated. "Yes." She spoke gently. "I am trying to understand something." She glanced toward the gate where assistants had already begun carrying trays of food back inside the house. "The food always stops when the cameras leave." Bello said nothing. Rukaya continued, "And the people who arrived later always leave hungry." Bello swallowed slowly. Rukaya then asked one final question. "Is the charity real?" At that moment, the compound gate was closed again and the crowd outside began walking away slowly. Mama Hafsa's children still carried empty bowls. Bello looked at them. Then he looked back at Rukaya. For several seconds, he said nothing. Finally, he spoke. "If you want the truth, you will need to see what happens after the cameras leave." Rukaya did not speak immediately. She simply closed her notebook and nodded. She looked toward the compound gate where the assistants were already dragging the last trays of food back inside the house. Outside the gates, several people still waited with bowls, but one assistant waved them away and shut the gates. "Come back tomorrow." The streets became quiet again. Rukaya turned back to Bello. "Can I come tomorrow evening?" Bello nodded. "Yes, but you must stand where the cameras cannot see you." The next evening, Ramadan returned with its usual hunger. By late afternoon, the streets in front of Alhaji Suleiman's house began getting filled again. Mama Hafsat arrived again with her two children. She greeted Bello. "Good evening." "Good evening, Mama," Bello greeted back. The children looked tired but hopeful. Across the streets, Rukaya stood behind a small shop pretending to buy bottled water, but her eyes were watching everything. Soon, the cameramen arrived and the bright ring light turned the gates into a stage again. Alhaji Suleiman stepped outside wearing a spotless white kaftan. The charity performance began. Plates moved, cameras clicked, and prayers rose. "May God reward you, Alhaji. May your wealth increase." Rukayat wrote everything in her notebook. Then the camera stopped and the cameramen packed their equipment. They left, and exactly like every other evening, the assistants began carrying the remaining trays of rice back inside the compound. Several people still stood outside the gates. One old man raised his voice politely and said, "Excuse me, we are still waiting." The assistant shrugged. "Distribution has finished. Go home." The gates closed. Mama Hafsat stared at the gates. Her youngest child tugged at her wrapper. "Mama, are we not eating today?" Mama Hafsat forced a small smile. "Maybe tomorrow." However, Rukayat had seen enough. Her pen moved across the notebook like a small machine. She stepped away from the shop slowly, but that night she did not sleep much. By morning, her article was ready. 2 days later, the story appeared online and the headlines spread quickly through phones across Kano. When charity becomes performance, the truth behind Ramadan food distribution. The article included pictures of the crowd waiting, the cameras, the trays being removed after filming, and the hungry people outside the gates. Within hours, the story traveled everywhere. People shared it, commented, and argued about it. That evening, the mosque near the neighborhood was full. Imam Musa stood on the pulpit during the Maghrib sermon. His voice was serious as he said, "Charity that seeks applause has already received its reward." The mosque became quiet. Several men lowered their heads. Everyone knew the story. Alhaji Suleiman saw it too. He sat in his living room staring at the screen, and his face lost all its confidence. The business partners who had been praising his generosity before began calling, but their voices sounded different now. They sounded less friendly. 2 days later, the businessmen who funded the charity program announced a new decision. The Ramadan feeding program would continue, but it would be under the supervision of the mosque committee, without cameras or publicity, certainly without Alhaji Suleiman. On the first evening of the new arrangement, something surprising happened. The food distribution looked smaller, but everyone on the line received something. Mama Hafsat and her children ate that evening, and she smiled for the first time in many days. Bello stood nearby watching everything quietly. He loved how the charity felt peaceful. Meanwhile, in the neighborhood, another type of story began spreading through words of mouth. They said that the man who once loved cameras had suddenly become allergic to them because, for the first time in many years, Alhaji Suleiman remained indoors, afraid of the very cameras he had once controlled. Thank you for watching the story. Kindly share your thoughts about the story with me in the comment section. What lesson did you learn from the story? Kindly share the story out with your loved ones and give the story a thumbs up. Subscribe to this channel if you've not done so by now. Until I bring another story your way. Bye.